My name is Louise. As I was drying a cracked porcelain cup, the doorbell shattered the silence like a thunderclap. Outside, the overcast sky in New York City hung low, and raindrops tapped impatiently against the windows of my cozy apartment. This was the home I'd rebuilt after a life I never thought I'd lose. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if the sound was just a figment of my imagination. After 15 years of living alone, silence had become my constant companion. For more than a decade, my son and his wife had acted as if I no longer existed. The doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent. I wiped my damp hands on a kitchen towel and slowly made my way to the door. Each step echoed on the wooden floor, stirring up a mix of dread and anger that I thought I'd buried long ago. This apartment was my sanctuary, a place where no one could distort my true self. Certainly not the people who had once cut me out of their lives with such cold precision. Out of habit, I peeked through the peephole. There they were. Ethan, my only child, stood hunched, his shoulders sagging under a burden heavier than the rain soaking his coat. Beside him, clutching the handle of a shabby suitcase, was Lily. The same Lily who had used her position at a small law firm to send me a letter, written in cold, legal terms, warning me to stop all contact with my newborn granddaughter or face legal consequences. My breath caught in my throat, and I had to steady myself against the wall. The hallway lights cast a pale glow on their faces. Ethan looked older, exhausted in a way that grief alone couldn't explain. Lily's eyes were red, but not from remorse. Hers were the tears of someone cornered by circumstances, not a guilty conscience. I unlocked the deadbolt but left the chain in place. When I cracked the door open, the smell of cold air and damp fabric wafted in. Ethan managed a strange smile, his lips trembling. "Mom," he said softly, a word I hadn't heard from him in 15 years. "We have nowhere else to go." The old wound inside me throbbed. I looked at the man who had once promised he'd never leave me and the woman who had spent years convincing him I was a threat. A storm of emotions raged within me: grief, anger, disbelief, and a strange, unwelcome tenderness. They might need me now, but I'd learned the hard way how to live without them. And they had no idea that their arrival would unlock all the memories of our past. I remembered the last time Ethan had that same hollow look in his eyes. It was 20 years ago, in a small, stuffy doctor's office under harsh fluorescent lights. The doctor had just told us that my husband, Henry, a kind-hearted mechanic who spent his days fixing cars and telling stories about his customers, had advanced-stage liver cancer. The air in the room felt thick, as if the walls were closing in on us. My knees went weak, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. Ethan was 23 then, still in his overalls from his job at a local auto repair shop. He sat rigidly in a plastic chair, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When the doctor left the room to give us some privacy, the silence was overwhelming. Henry reached for my hand, his fingers already trembling, and I leaned into him, holding on to his warmth. Ethan stared at the floor, blinking rapidly as if he could hold back his grief. The following months were a blur. Our small house in the suburbs became a maze of medicine bottles, stacks of medical papers, and blankets on the couch for the nights when Henry was too weak to climb the stairs. I took a leave from the community center where I taught art classes, thinking it would be temporary. I had no idea how long this journey would be. Ethan visited every evening after work. He smelled of engine oil and gasoline. Sometimes he brought groceries, even though Henry could barely eat. Desperate to help, he talked about his work, the funny things his co-workers did, and the local baseball team's chances. Henry would nod or smile weakly, mostly just listening. Every night when Ethan left, he'd hug me tightly and whisper that everything would be okay. I never argued with him, even though fear twisted in my chest like a knot. The winter Henry died was cold and gray. Snow covered the windowsills. One morning, his breathing became shallow and soft, like a gentle breeze fading away. I sat by his side, holding his hand, and whispered that he wasn't alone. When he took his last breath, the world seemed to stop. I pressed my forehead against his and stayed there until the nurse gently touched my shoulder. Grief seeped into me like a cold draft that I couldn't escape. At the funeral, Ethan stood between me and the coffin, his back straight and his jaw clenched, as if he were bracing for a storm. He held my hand so tightly that it hurt. After the service, he said he wouldn't leave me. Not now, not when it was just the two of us left. I clung to his words like a drowning person to a life raft. For a while, he meant it. Ethan moved back into his childhood bedroom, bringing with him the smell of the garage and the sound of his heavy footsteps. We developed a quiet routine, simple dinners at the old oak table, evenings watching old movies, and mornings where he'd grab a coffee on his way out while I packed his lunch. The house felt strange without Henry's laughter, but with Ethan there, it didn't feel empty. Looking back, I realize how tightly I held on to him. I thought he needed me as much as I needed him, that we were helping each other through the toughest time in our lives. Maybe it was true at first, but grief has a way of binding people together and then pushing them apart. I didn't see the signs. I didn't notice how little space there was between us, so little that we couldn't grow without bumping into each other. Then, one spring day, Ethan met someone new. I didn't know it then, but that moment changed everything. It was a mild afternoon, and Ethan took me to a small diner by the park. I arrived early, my nerves on edge, wondering if meeting this woman would be a turning point. When Ethan walked in with Lily by his side, I felt the shift immediately. She was beautiful in a sophisticated way, long, dark hair, a well-tailored suit, and an air of confidence. But what struck me most were her eyes, cold and calculating, as if she were sizing me up. Ethan hugged me quickly and then pulled out a chair for Lily. She extended her hand, her polite smile not reaching her eyes. I sensed something guarded about her, something brittle. But I pushed the thought aside. After losing Henry, I'd promised myself to embrace any new chapter in Ethan's life. So, I greeted her warmly and tried to hide my excitement at the idea of Ethan finding someone to love. The conversation started smoothly. I asked about her work, and she told me she was a junior lawyer at a small firm downtown. She spoke with a confident, clipped tone, choosing her words carefully. When I mentioned my art classes, she nodded politely, but her eyes drifted to the window, as if the topic made her uncomfortable. I thought it was just first meeting jitters. I tried to fill the silences by telling stories about Ethan's childhood, his love for drawing cars, his fear of thunderstorms. But every time I did, Lily's shoulders would tense up, and I could tell she didn't like being left out of the conversation. When the food arrived, I offered Lily a small box of handmade chocolates I'd made that morning. It was my way of showing welcome. She took the box with a tight smile and mumbled a thank you, but her fingers curled around it as if she were unsure if it was a gift or a test. Later, Ethan told me she thought the chocolates were delicious, but the gesture was a bit much. I had no idea at the time, but I felt a subtle change in the air, like the first sign of a storm. Ethan fell for Lily quickly. Within a few months, he was talking about moving in with her. I wanted to be happy for him, but watching him pack up his childhood room and put our shared memories in boxes made my heart ache. He promised me nothing would change between us, but I knew deep down that something had already shifted. The first real conflict came when Ethan invited me to their new apartment. I spent the day cooking a big pot of stew, Henry's favorite recipe, and brought it over, wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. Lily opened the door, and in her eyes, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite understand, annoyance or maybe fear. The apartment was spotless, decorated in a modern, minimalist style. My pot of stew looked out of place in her pristine kitchen. She thanked me, but her voice was cold. During dinner, every time I offered to help clean up or pack the leftovers, she insisted she could handle it. When the conversation turned to Ethan's childhood, she kept saying, "We need our own space." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. That night, Ethan explained that Lily believed in setting healthy boundaries. She thought I was too involved, that my gestures, like the stew and the chocolates, could be seen as intrusive. I went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how my kindness could be misinterpreted. I wondered if I'd held on to Ethan too tightly after Henry's death. Maybe Lily saw a side of me I didn't want to show, a mother afraid to let go. But boundaries soon became barriers. Our weekends together became rare. Phone calls went unanswered, and texts were replied to with short, cold messages. I told myself not to take it personally, that young couples needed space to build their own life. But the silence grew louder with each passing week, so thick that I sometimes paced around my living room just to hear the sound of my own footsteps. The breaking point came one Sunday when I stopped by with a bouquet of flowers. I'd texted Ethan earlier, but he didn't reply. Lily opened the door and stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her. She thanked me for the flowers, but her tone was firm. She said she preferred advance notice for visits, that unannounced drop-ins made her uncomfortable, and that I needed to respect their home as their private space. Her words stung like a slap in the face. I apologized, even though I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong. As I walked back to my car, holding the flowers against my chest, I felt a familiar ache in my heart, the same feeling I'd had after Henry died, when the world changed, and I was left trying to find my place in it. I didn't know then that losing my husband was just the beginning. The next loss was on its way, and it would take years to unfold. 2 years later, my granddaughter, Ava, was born on a cold December morning. For a brief moment, I hoped that the arrival of a baby would soften the invisible wall between me and Ethan's family. When Ethan called to say Lily was in labor, I grabbed my coat, packed a bag of handmade baby blankets, and rushed to the hospital through the snow. I sat in the waiting room, my heart pounding with excitement, imagining the moment I'd hold Ava for the first time. When Ethan finally appeared, his face tired but proud, I felt a sense of relief. He led me to the room where Lily was lying in bed, pale but glowing. Ava was tiny, wrapped in a white blanket, her fist curled like a little ball. I asked if I could hold her, and Lily hesitated for a second, just long enough to hurt my feelings. But then she handed her over. The warmth of that little body against my chest was like a ray of sunshine in the cold. For a moment, I thought we were starting a new chapter, that love could mend the broken bonds. But it didn't last. The next day, when I brought soup and fresh clothes, Lily started talking about new rules from the pediatrician: no kissing the baby's face, limited visitors, and strict hand-washing procedures. I nodded, trying to be respectful, but every time I tried to help, it seemed to irritate her. If I adjusted the blanket, she'd fix it again. If I gave an opinion, she'd counter it with what the doctor said. Ethan was too caught up in the joy of being a father to notice the tension. When they took Ava home, I baked a cake and brought over some groceries. Lily took the bags but didn't invite me in. She said Ava was fussy, that they needed rest, and that I could come another time. Her smile never reached her eyes. A week later, I asked if I could stop by to help with the laundry or hold Ava while she showered. Lily replied with a text an hour later, saying she preferred to limit visitors during the recovery period. I told myself it was normal for new parents to be protective, but I knew something was wrong. One night, I brought a box of baby toys I'd bought on sale. I knocked on the door, waited, and knocked again. When Lily opened the door, she stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her, just like before. She thanked me, but said they needed a predictable routine and asked me to call before coming over, even if it was just to drop something off. Her voice was polite, but her eyes were cold, as if I were a threat. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my hands ached. I kept telling myself she was tired, that new motherhood made her protective, and that I needed to give her time. So, I pulled back, waiting for an invitation that never came. Weeks turned into months. I only saw Ava during short, supervised visits in public places: a park, a coffee shop. Lily rarely joined us. When she did, she watched my every move around Ava with a critical eye. If I held Ava too long, she'd gently remind me the baby needed to rest. If I talked about how Ethan loved stuffed animals as a child, she'd say that modern parenting was different. I kept trying to be patient, hoping that things would get better. But my patience was wearing thin. Then came Ava's second birthday. I spent weeks choosing the perfect gift, a set of art supplies, thinking she might enjoy drawing like Ethan did when he was little. When I arrived at their apartment, I could feel Lily's eyes on me. The party was small, mostly their neighbors and a few of Ethan's friends. I put the gift on the table and went to the kitchen to ask if I could help. Lily shook her head with that tight smile I'd come to hate. The moment that changed everything happened while I was cutting fruit. A glass fell and shattered on the floor. Before I could even react, Lily rushed in, her eyes wide with panic. She said I'd placed the glass too close to the edge, that Ava could have been hurt, and that this was exactly why they needed boundaries. Ethan rushed over, looking confused, but he automatically sided with Lily. I tried to explain that I hadn't touched the glass, that I didn't even know it was there. But Lily was already sweeping up the broken pieces, shaking her head and muttering that she'd warned him. I left the party early, my heart pounding and my face red with shame. As I walked down the hallway to the elevator, I had a feeling that something irreversible had happened. I didn't know then how right I was. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Lily's law firm. Inside was a 2-page notice, written in cold, legal language. It said that my behavior had caused distress, that continued contact could be considered harassment, and that I should stop all communication with Ethan and Ava until further notice. I stood in my kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind me, reading the letter over and over again until the words blurred. I couldn't believe it. Surely Ethan wouldn't agree to this. Surely Lily hadn't twisted things so much that I was the bad guy in my own family. When I called Ethan, he didn't answer. When I texted him, the message was delivered, but he never replied. I paced around my living room for hours, then days, like a lost soul. Eventually, he sent me a short, rehearsed message. He said they needed space, that it was for the best, and that he hoped I understood. I didn't understand. But I understood the silence that followed. It was absolute. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. I couldn't sleep, and I forgot to eat. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, looking at a photo of Ethan as a little boy, wondering how the same child who used to love me so much could now think I was a danger. There were nights when the weight of that thought was so heavy that I could barely breathe. I felt myself sinking into a darkness deeper than the one I'd fallen into after Henry's death. I found myself holding a bottle of sleeping pills one evening. I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet, the cold floor seeping through my clothes. The thought of ending the pain crossed my mind, but then my eyes fell on a stack of paintings my students at the community center had made for me. The bright colors, the crooked lines, and the love captured in those paintings softened my heart. I put the bottle aside and hugged my knees until the storm inside me passed. The next morning, I opened my art supplies cabinet. I reached for a canvas and a brush. I didn't know what I was going to paint, but the familiar motion steadied my hands. Art had always been my way of expressing love, and no one could take that away from me. As I painted, the smell of paint filled the air, and I realized that I was still here. Bruised, alone, but alive. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough to start over. Now, here they are at my door, asking for help. I look at them, and I know that opening this door means opening old wounds. But maybe, just maybe, there's a chance for us to heal.